Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the ThinkPad Buyer's Guide. So the ThinkPads I have before you are all Core 2 Duo ThinkPads. We have the T60, the X61, and the X200. So I'm showing these ThinkPads, but there are other ThinkPads in this line. You have the T61, the T400, the X60, the X300, the T500, etc., etc., etc. So I'm going to be talking through the differences between some of these ThinkPads and which one within this era of ThinkPads you should probably get if you're looking for something in this price range. One thing I should note before I get started, some of the ThinkPads I'm mentioning here are more than 10 years old. Some of these laptops are more than a decade old. So even if you get one that is fully working, you should not expect it to last forever. It is getting to the point where some of the components in these laptops will be failing to the point of not being repairable. Whether it's the graphics card, whether it's the motherboard, or even the backlight and the screen. With these older ThinkPads, if you're buying one, I would say proceed with caution. These things are built like tanks, they last forever, but they don't last forever. Nothing lasts forever, especially computer parts. They're all going to fail eventually. And I'm going to particularly point out the ThinkPad T61, which I will be talking about here. It's a fantastic computer and I highly recommend it. But if you get one with a dedicated graphics card with an NVIDIA GPU, I suggest taking a look at the serial number and seeing if it is a newer revised motherboard or not. Because there was a huge recall, a huge defect with the GPUs in these T61s that lead to failure. So if you have one of the revised motherboards, you should be good to go for a decent amount of time. But if you have the older revision, the older defective GPU, then it's only a matter of time before the laptop fails. And I should also say that with laptops in general, with any laptop, regardless of which one I'm talking about, be wary, especially with older ones, if they have a dedicated GPU. Yes, dedicated GPUs are nice because they allow for better graphics in games, they allow for better performance in photo and video editing, they have all sorts of advantages to them. But I have found that laptop GPUs tend to be very unreliable. Look no further than the MacBook Pro. Going back to the non-unibody MacBook Pros in the mid-2000s, they were plagued with GPU failures. They are notorious for the GPU failing. And I think the 2011 MacBook Pros had GPU issues. I think the 2013 or 2014 MacBook Pros, there were GPU issues. It seems like every couple of years there is a huge amount of MacBooks that have GPU failures. And there are other laptops that have these issues because either NVIDIA or AMD just messes up and puts a bunch of defective graphics cards in these laptops, like the T61. So I just wanted to put that little kind of disclaimer / proceed at your own risk thing at the beginning of this video, because you really do have to keep in mind that these laptops are in some cases more than 10 years old at this point. Granted, they're still great computers, and I would definitely recommend one as a beginner's computer, as a little beater computer, a computer to just mess around with programming on, or something to give to a kid or a younger sibling. So first off is the T60. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this computer because I already went into pretty heavy detail on it in my previous video where I compared it to a T43. For those of you who didn't watch the video and don't feel like watching it, the T43 was the last IBM ThinkPad, and the T60 was the first Lenovo ThinkPad, at least in the T series. I know there are some other models in the middle in the transition, but when it comes to the T series, the T43 was it for IBM, and the T60 was Lenovo. So the T60 is pretty much the oldest ThinkPad I would recommend to somebody who wants to actually use it for day-to-day tasks, be it work, school, or just entertainment. Because this is the oldest one that can actually do anything without choking. The T60 is not going to be the fastest computer in the world, but you can still browse the web on it, you can still check your email, you can still go through Facebook, you can watch YouTube videos and even stream them at 720p without it stuttering too hard. You can even edit PowerPoints and documents and all that sort of stuff. I didn't test Microsoft Office on here because I don't use Microsoft Office, but I used Google Drive, I used Google Docs and Google Slides, and they worked perfectly, which is amazing for a computer that is 12 years old as of this video. So this laptop was released in 2006. Most of them will have Core Duo or Core 2 Duo processors in them. The main difference is that Core 2 Duo processors are 64-bit, and they're faster for the most part. But both of them are dual-core processors, so you will have better performance than if it were a single-core processor. Now, some of these I think came with Core Solo processors, which are single-core processors, but I have yet to encounter a T60 that came with a Core Solo. So you should be good there, and even if it does come with a Core Solo, it's pretty easy to take the computer apart and upgrade the processor, because you could do that with these. Technically, these take up to 4 gigabytes of RAM. However, due to I believe a chipset or motherboard limitation, only 3 gigabytes of RAM can actually be used. This is still enough to get by with just a couple of tabs of Google Chrome and maybe Spotify running in the background and a Word document or whatever. But it is a little limitation that I should make you aware of. Most of these have a 4x3 display. On the 14-inch, it's either a 1024 by 768 or a 1400 by 1050 display. On the 15-inch, it was either 1024 by 768, 1400 by 1050, or 1600 by 1200. And some of the 15-inch screens are FlexView IPS displays. These are very high-quality displays with amazing viewing angles and really good colors and contrast. If you find a ThinkPad with an IPS display, get it, because they are hard to find and they go for insane prices on eBay. And you can even transplant a T61 motherboard into one of these, so you can have newer, faster processors and faster speeds while still having a high-quality display. The easiest way to tell if it's an IPS display or not is to simply tilt the display back and see if the colors invert. If the colors invert, it's a TN panel. If the colors stay the same, it's an IPS display. Now, they also made a few T60s in the 15-inch variant that were widescreen. However, I have not seen too many of these. In terms of I/O, you have 3 USB ports. They're all USB 2.0. You have Ethernet, you have a modem, you have VGA output, you have an optical drive which can be swapped out for a hard drive or a battery to improve the battery life of this machine. And you also get a PC card slot and an express card slot to add more expandability. There's also a wireless switch and an infrared port on the bottom. The T60 and the full-screen T61s were the last ThinkPads to have the infrared port on them before they dropped it. So the T60 is a great computer. I think it's still usable as a daily driver, but if you want something that's a little more future-proof, I would suggest going for a T61 or an X61. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the T61 and the X61. These are significant historically for a few reasons. For one, they were the last generation of ThinkPads to carry the IBM logo, and not even all of them have it. Like this X61 doesn't have the IBM logo, but you could configure it with that option if you wanted to. After the T61 and X61, you would not be able to get a ThinkPad with the IBM logo unless you stuck it on yourself. Also, the 4x3 T61 and the X61 were the last mainstream laptops to have a 4x3 aspect ratio display, which some people like, some people hate. Everyone seems to be kind of divided on the issue. I personally prefer widescreen for media consumption and for multitasking, but for checking email and going through long web pages and coding, I prefer 4x3. So now my opinions are out of the way. These were the last mainstream laptops and the last ThinkPads to have a 4x3 aspect ratio display. And then, more exclusive to the X61, this was the last ThinkPad that you could not get with the touchpad. This only has the track point. With the X200, you could get it with the touchpad as an option, same with the X201. After the X201, all ThinkPads came standard with the touchpad as well as the track point. So the T61 has two versions, the 4x3 version and the 16x10 widescreen version. The 4x3 version is almost physically identical to the T60, with the only exception being the display is offset a little bit. I don't know why they did this, but for some reason on the T61 and the T400, Lenovo thought it'd be funny to offset the display. I don't get it either. But the widescreen version has a few physical differences. For one, it has FireWire instead of an infrared port. It also uses different batteries than the 4x3 T61, so they are not compatible. Also, some of the widescreen T61s could be ordered with a webcam, a first for the ThinkPad line. However, this was not a standard feature, so not all of the T61s out there had a webcam. In terms of actual processing power, these use Core 2 Duo processors. They're faster than the ones in the T60. Also, the T61 can fully use the 4 GB of RAM that are available. Through the Middleton's BIOS modification, you can use 8 GB of RAM with the computer. You can also use third-party wireless cards because the Middleton's BIOS removes Lenovo's whitelist for limiting what kind of cards can be used in the system. The Middleton's BIOS also unlocks SATA 2 speeds, so if you want a little bit more performance out of your solid-state drive or hard drive, you can use the Middleton's BIOS to unlock faster speeds. Also, with the Middleton's BIOS upgrade, you can install faster processors in the T61. Like I said earlier, the T61 has a major GPU issue with some of the NVIDIA GPUs, so again, proceed with caution with any T61 you buy that has a dedicated GPU. Now, when it comes to the X60 and the X61, they're basically miniaturized versions of the T60 and T61. The main difference is that they use soldered-in processors rather than socketed processors, so you can't upgrade them. Most of the limitations that the T60 had also apply to the X60. And the Middleton's BIOS that can be used with the T61 can also be used with the X61 to unlock some of those same new features. However, I should note that since the X61 has soldered-in processors, the ability to use faster processors than what could be configured does not apply to the X61. Another thing I should know about the X61, especially after using one of these, this area of the palm rest can get very warm because that's where the wireless card is and it gets pretty hot. So you should keep that in mind if you get one of these. Moving on to the T400 and X200. These laptops started Lenovo's new numbering scheme for the ThinkPads. You had a letter at the beginning of the model name, which indicated which series it was. The first number of the model is the screen size, the X series being the thin and light ultra portable, the T series being the all-around laptop, and the W series being the mobile desktop workstation. The second two numbers in the model were generally for revisions, the first number being for a larger revision and the second number being for a small revision. For example, the T410 is a major revision to the T400, while the X201 is just a very slight upgrade over the X200. So it kind of makes sense once you figure it out, like it's kind of sequential order. So you have the T400 came first, and then the T410 was a couple years later, T420 the year after that, T430 the year after that, T440, so on and so forth. So now that that's out of the way, let's look at these ThinkPads. So in terms of the design, the T400 is pretty much identical to the widescreen T61. The biggest under-the-hood difference with the T400 is that it uses DDR3 RAM instead of DDR2, so it's a lot faster and it's a lot cheaper to upgrade to 8 GB if you want to. Of course, you also have faster internal processors, and the T400 was the first ThinkPad to have switchable graphics. So you had T400s that had the Intel graphics and also had dedicated graphics. I can't remember off the top of my head if it's NVIDIA or ATI, I'm sorry guys. One thing I should note about this though, if you decide to purchase a T400 and it has switchable graphics, I would recommend sticking to Windows 7 as the switchable graphics don't work properly in Windows 10. Trust me, when I had a T400 I tried, but I eventually gave up and stuck Windows 7 on the machine. The X200 is pretty much the 12-inch equivalent of the T400. And this is an interesting redesign in that it uses a widescreen display instead of a 4x3 display. We kind of covered that. But because of this, the X200 has a full-sized keyboard as opposed to the X61, which uses a shrunken down keyboard. This is really nice to be able to have the full-sized keyboard. Later X-series ThinkPads like the X220 and X230 actually used the same keyboards as the T420 and T430. Kind of interesting. There are many other models, like the R-series. You had the R60, R61, and R400. After the R400, the R-series was actually discontinued. You also have things like the W-series, the T61P, the Z61, etc., etc. And you also had the T400S, which was a slimmed down version of the T400, which also used the same type of processors and everything. However, its design was a complete refresh and more closely resembles that of the T410. So I'm not going to be really talking about that here. So of all these ThinkPads, which ones do I personally recommend? If you're looking for a general all-around computer, if you don't mind whether the display is 4x3 or 16x10, I would go with the T400 as it is the newest of the bunch. It doesn't have any known GPU failing issues other than the switchable graphics not working right in Windows 10. And since they're newer machines, the likelihood of one failing is a little bit less than if it were a T60 or T61. One thing I will say though about the T400 is if you get one of these, swap out its keyboard with one from a T61 or T60, as they made the keyboards thinner on the T400 despite being the same fit as the T61 keyboard. As a result, they have a little bit more flex and have a more mushy feeling to them. If you don't care about that, then don't do that, but I would rather spend the $20 and get a better keyboard. Same goes for the X series. If you don't mind having a widescreen display, go for the X200. You'll get a full-size keyboard, you get DDR3 RAM, and you get the newest processors of the bunch. If you want a 4x3 display, opt for the 4x3 T61 or the X61. And if you really want to be a sucker and get an IPS display, get a T60, a 15-inch T60. But if you want newer processing power in that T60, you can swap in the motherboard from a T61. There's plenty of videos on how to do this and plenty of guides and forums on the internet explaining this. The T60 you can probably find for around $50, give or take. T61, T400 I've seen from $50 to $150. For any of these laptops, I think if you're paying more than $100, maybe $125 for the newer ones, you're getting ripped off. So don't spend too much on these things. They're almost 10 years old, if not older than 10 years, so don't waste your money on them. But all of these are great computers, especially the T400 I still think is a very capable computer for schoolwork, for entertainment, for whatever. And the T60 really does hold its own. It is still very capable for being a 12-year-old computer. It's really amazing to think of how much this can still do as something that was made back during the Bush administration. Damn, that makes me feel old. Anyway, in the next video, we're going to be talking about the first 3 generations of the Core i-series ThinkPads, the T410, the T420, and the T430. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.